Hey everyone, today we're going to go and take a look at Cinema's cloth system. Now I will just preface this and say that Cinema's cloth system is naturally not one of the newer features. It's been around for quite a while, but despite this it's still not a bad feature. There are certain limitations because of the age, but if you want to do some realistic blowing flags, draping cloth, that sort of thing, there's probably not much of a better choice directly in Cinema itself. So let's go take a look, shall we? We're going to add in a plane object. This will be our cloth surface itself. And here is our first limitation. The cloth system will only work with objects which are editable. So this plane object, I can't add the cloth system to this, or well, I could, but it just wouldn't do anything. So it has to be a raw polygon object. So for the moment, let's just make this thing editable. We'll come back and have a look at some of the settings of the actual object itself a little bit later. But for now, let's make it editable, turn it into raw polygons, and the process of turning it into cloth is pretty much just one tag. If you go to Tags, Simulation, down in here we have the cloth tag, and you may notice the icon is a little blue t-shirt, which ironically is one of the few things it's not actually that good at. So anyway, once we've got this blue t-shirt cloth icon on our object, we can press play and it will do whatever cloth does, which in this case is just fall down and go nowhere. So naturally we need to give it a reason to stay still. We need to either give it something to land on top of, or we need to hold on to the cloth somewhere so that it can blow and drape in the wind. So let's start off by giving it something to land on. So let's pick another object. We'll just go for perhaps a sphere. And in this particular case, you can use other objects. They don't have to be made editable. They don't have to be polygon objects. So in order for us to collide the cloth with this sphere, let's place that underneath. And if we press play, we won't really get anything. For the most part, all of Cinema's physics engines, you need to tell an object it should be part of it. So for cloth to collide with an object, we have to make it part of the cloth physics system. So let's pause and rewind this and just tell our sphere down here, you, under tags, you should be a cloth collider. Now once this is added to the object, Cinema now knows, you should interact with the cloth. So when we press play, it'll fall down and hopefully land on top of the object. So this is sort of like the basic setup. Nominate one object to be cloth, nominate another object to collide with cloth, and you can now get the physics between the two. So let's just extend our project a little bit longer. Let's say maybe 200 frames rather than just 3 seconds of animation. And let's start solving some of the biggest issues we can see with this. So the first thing is that it is very clearly very faceted. There's lots of horrible, harsh polygons on this object. Now there are a couple of ways of dealing with this. I'll give you the quick short version and then we'll deal with the proper way of fixing this a little bit later. But the quick short version is just chuck it inside a subdivision object. This will give you generally the best quality, the smoothest finish. So here's my cloth, this is the plane, just chuck it inside, and then all those horrible polygons are now smoothened off. So that improves the quality quite noticeably. And the other big issue we generally have here is the overlapping. Now as this cloth falls down, it falls down from the sky, lands on the object, and you can immediately see these big pieces here overlapping. We have a couple of ways of going about this. One is fast but completely hit and miss, and the other method is more reliable but it will slow the simulation down. So the quick fix is to choose your little t-shirt cloth icon on the plane. Let's pause this and come down here. What you'll find is we have a number of tags. We'll go through pretty much all of this, but just for now your two choices are under forces. There is something called self-repulsion. That's what you do when you're a bit emo and you don't like how you look in the mirror. What this does is it's not collision detection. All it does is it sort of, what's the best analogy for this? It's like taking two magnets of the same polarity. When they try and push together, when they get closer and closer, they'll get closer and then they'll push and push and they don't want to touch, but they'll push each other away. But there's no guarantee that those magnets wouldn't ever touch. And in the same way, there's no guarantee that the cloth won't ever intersect itself. It just usually dramatically reduces the chances. With that said, it does sometimes just go completely wrong and make everything worse. So at the minute when this thing falls down, it falls down onto the sphere, it immediately overlaps. So if we try a little bit of self-repulsion, the emo button, let's try again, falls down, and yeah, okay, fine. In this particular case, it just hasn't helped at all. Sometimes it does work. It's the one I'd go for first because there's very little computational overhead, but it doesn't always work, unfortunately. So your other choice, let's forget that. Your other choice is considered an expert setting. We're experts now. And it's just simply called self-collision. Let's turn it on, let's rewind, let's press play. Usually it slows the simulation down quite a bit, your frame rate will drop. So we've solved that, that's not colliding, that's good, but we do still have the neighbour over to the side. Now, we'll probably deal with this a little bit later, but if you just wanted to sort of quickly improve very generally the quality of your cloth simulation, self-collision is the quickest, simplest way of doing it. So we'll improve this a little bit later, but first let's get some of the more basic settings done and out of the way. Okay, so taking this as our starting point, let's go to the tag, let's have a look at our settings and see what we've got. So, stiffness, flexion, and rubber. Now, in here, these three settings probably helps to give you a little bit of background as to how the cloth system works. If I show you the wireframe mesh, here's our polygon. So, what we basically have, the cloth system is a series of springs. So just imagine a really cheap sort of a Boy Scout, Girl Guide, summer camp camp bed. The kind where it's just sort of a series of springs spread out in this sort of grid with a mattress sat on top of it. That's kind of how Cinema's cloth system works. So in reality, from this point here to this point here, there is a spring running across. And there is also a spring running across from here to here. So in short, from every polygon to the next one, horizontally, vertically, diagonally, there's a series of springs. And that's what these flexion and rubber settings do. They're basically determining how stiff, how strong those springs are. So I'll just sort of boil this down to a simplified version. Stiffness is how close to the original shape should the cloth try to remain. And that's generally quite an important one, because if you don't have stiffness, what happens is the cloth will just stretch and stretch and stretch. It'll sort of almost melt into a goo. So you do generally leave the stiffness up really, really high, usually up at 100%. This is not really how stiff the cloth is in the sort of normal way you'd say it to a normal person. This is just sort of does the cloth stretch or not. Flexion, and this is where some of the words used to describe these settings maybe weren't the best, but flexion is how rubbery the cloth is. So I tell you, let me just show you some of these sort of in action. So first let's go back to the stiffness for a second. Let's hit play. So the cloth falls down, it lands on top, and it pretty much stays there. But if we don't have any stiffness, the cloth will sort of stretch and deform. Let me lose these flexion settings as well. There we go. So without stiffness, the cloth can basically just sort of melt and stretch and deform, and it all goes horribly wrong. So stiffness is, should the cloth keep the original dimensions? Maybe that's the best way of putting it. And if we put that back up to full and rewind, the cloth now pretty much stays the same dimensions the cloth was originally designed for. Flexion is really how rubbery the cloth is. So think of something like a sort of dry wetsuit or a sort of rubber sheet. The more flexion we have, the more rubbery the cloth will become. So if I bump this up to maybe 50% and the cloth falls down, it'll sort of bounce and wiggle and jiggle and flop around quite a bit. And if I bump it up even higher, it's just a really rubbery sheet. So this makes the cloth less cloth-like and more sort of oil, petroleum, rubber based instead. Which is only confusing because there is another setting underneath actually called rubber. And to be honest, this is how stretchy the cloth can get. So let's turn this back down to the default. So if we bump up the rubber, this is how far the cloth can stretch. So if I say 50% and rewind, is that enough to show? So it's gotten a bit longer, it's stretched a bit. Let's go for 100. There we go. So 100 is a little bit silly. Let's knock it down to maybe 90. But this is sort of how far the cloth can stretch. So it allows it to sort of elongate further than its original shape is. Now, long story short, what should you generally use for realistic cloth? My advice is leave stiffness up at 100%, otherwise your cloth will melt, and then just set the others down at 0. That is generally the most realistic, loose, soft, silk-like cloth simulation. A little bit of flexion will give more structure to it. It'll sort of give it a little bit more bounce. So maybe put a little bit of flexion in. But generally, I'd leave these two down pretty low, and that's going to be really your best bet as far as the cloth sim goes. If you want it to be even more silky and fluid and flowing, your best bet is actually adding more polygons to the original object. Let me turn off this subdivision for a moment and rewind. Cloth can only bend as much as the original structure allows it to. That is to say, if you've got big chunky polygons in your structure, then you can only have sort of quite large, round, curvaceous curves on your object. The more you subdivide this original plane object, the more fluid and silky the motion of the cloth will be. But the natural downside of this is that the more polygons you have, the more processing there is for the simulation, and therefore the slower it gets. So for a fast simulation, you want a low polygon object. For a silky, smooth simulation, you need lots of polygons. So do consider adding more polygons to your original object at the very start of the process. You can add them now, and that should generally be fine, but yeah, it will slow the simulation down quite a bit. If I hit play, we get a pretty good frame rate. You know, we're holding a good 30 frames per second here. But if I rewind and I divide up the polygons on this mesh, so I'm just going to choose subdivide. This will give me a more fluid motion, but keep in mind that command, the subdivide command, this has now increased how many polygons I have fourfold. So that does mean there's now 4 times as much work for the simulation to do. So when I press play on this, you can immediately hopefully see there that my frame rate is much worse than it was when I started. So I've maybe got sort of 10, 15 frames per second. It's gotten a lot worse, but it will now at least flow and give me a lot more sort of fluted, nice undulating shapes within my cloth system. So that's just a price you're going to have to pay for a better simulation. Anyway, let's go back. Let's undo the subdivision and hopefully it still works. Yep, good. Okay, let's carry on then. So going down. Now, bounce is a bit of a silly setting. This is just literally how much bounce and rebound does the cloth system have. And look, let's just be honest with each other. Who wants bouncy cloth? Probably no one. 30% bounce. You might think, well, that's still a reasonable amount, but I don't really see the cloth bouncing. You've got to consider something. The cloth has a bounce setting, and on our sphere we gave it that cloth collider tag. That also has a bounce setting. And long story short, they multiply. So although the cloth might be 30% bouncy, which is quite a bouncy bit of cloth, it's colliding with something which is 20% bouncy. 20% of 30% is only 6. So overall, once you've considered both settings, my cloth is only 6% bouncy. That's really why it doesn't particularly seem to bounce very much. So with that said, you probably don't really want to ever really play around with the bounce. It's already pretty much nothing, and bouncy cloth just doesn't look realistic, so leave that one well alone. Friction. how much grip does the cloth have? Now, in terms of maths, this is the same as before. My cloth has 70% friction, which is basically just how much grip there is. And my collider has 20% friction. So 20% multiplied with 70% is 14%. So again, there's not that much friction. So I'll tell you what, let's move this sphere off to the side. Oops, oh, that's resized it. Let's move this sphere off to the side slightly. So at the minute, my cloth falls down and it fairly quickly slides off to the side. It falls off the sphere, especially if I push it over a bit further to the side. So basically there's not that much grip. It's quite happy to just slide around all over the surface. Let's turn those back on, I think, to help. So if you want it to grip and stay on there, basically turn up the friction, but do keep in mind the lowest value we have right now is actually on the collision object. This has only got 20% friction. So if I just crank that up to 100, it will now stay on the object quite a bit more. There'll be a lot more grip. Keep in mind, there's no such thing as 100% perfect grip in Cinema's cloth system. Even if you turn these things all up to full, it will still slide. So you can only go up to 100. That's pretty much your limit. And if that's not enough, tough. I never said Cinema's cloth system was amazing. Okay, so there's our friction. What else we got? Mass. Not too useful. Mass is really just how heavy an object is. And you might think, quite rightly so, surely a heavy object will behave differently from a light bit of cloth. And no, not really. Mass is just how much weight cloth has when it hits another piece of cloth. So if I have a mass of 1, it falls down, it drapes, it behaves normally. If I have a mass of 1,000, it falls down, it drapes, it does the exact same thing. There is no difference. This will only determine, let's say I've got a piece of cloth over here with a mass of 1, and I've got a piece of cloth here with a mass of 10. When these two pieces of cloth collide, the cloth with a mass of 10 would push the lighter piece of cloth out the way. So it'd be like throwing some leather at some paper. You know, the leather is just going to smash the paper out the way. So yeah, that's all the mass really does. But given throwing cloth at cloth is probably not the most common thing, you're not really going to notice this thing doing much at all. Size, again, I'm just going to skip over it because it's not a massively useful setting. Size just lets you quickly resize the size of the cloth. So keep in mind before when I told you that cloth is really just a series of springs. The size setting is how long the springs are. So let's zoom out for a second and rewind. So here's my cloth. This is how big I told Cinema the cloth should be. And when I press play, it falls down. However, if I tell Cinema the cloth should be twice as big, 200% size, as soon as I press play, the first thing Cinema does is go, spring, the cloth gets bigger. It suddenly expands because I've told all the springs you should be twice as long as you currently are. And I could go mad. I could say, oh, 500%. And now the cloth will be, it'll get a bit peed off when you first start, but it'll suddenly expand 5 times larger. So you can probably see immediately this is not a particularly useful setting. With that in mind, do consider, whenever I tell you a setting in Cinema is useless, what I mean is you probably don't want to use it very often. Now, I can think of no general use for suddenly telling your cloth it should be 5 times bigger. However, if you want to make an interesting bit of motion graphics, if you just want to make a nice swirly, non-specific sort of physics moving shape, animate it. Hey, maybe tell your cloth at one point, hey, you should be 50% size, hit the keyframe button. A few seconds later, maybe make it suddenly get bigger and it can drape over, and then maybe keyframe it getting smaller again and it will suddenly shrink wrap around the object it fell around. So, you know, you can use these things for sort of interesting, weird things, but it's just not a particularly useful setting for just actual realistic cloth sims. So anyway. Now, the last setting in here is called tear. I will come back to this because I need to show you something else before this will work, but just in short for the time being, tear is the ability to tear cloth. If you pull it hard enough, you can actually rip and shred your cloth system. So we'll come back to it, because right now if I turn this thing on it won't work, because I still need to show you something else, because certain things have to happen in a certain order. Anyway, that will do our general sort of properties for now. Let's move over to our next page and have a look at forces, and this will be a fairly quick one. Don't waste your time with them. Again, keep in mind, cloth is a very old bit of cinema's architecture, and when it was first made, in order for you to have gravity and air resistance and wind and turbulence blowing through the cloth, you had to come into these settings and type in your values. Well, since it was originally made, you can now actually use cinema's particle modifiers. So if you want to blow your cloth with some wind, it's far easier to just grab a wind object, place it where you want, rotate it into the direction it should face, and then set a strength so it blows the wind. And that's far, far easier than trying to come down here and say, right, how much wind do we have in the X direction? How much wind do we have in the Y direction? That's not a very fun way of trying to define the wind. So I would pretty much ignore everything in here, just forget it exists, and just use cinema's particle effects. Probably about the only thing I would consider in here is just the fact that there is by default gravity. So you can use cinema's particle gravity. It won't be any different from the one you've got here, so just out of sheer laziness, I would tend to just leave this gravity setting in here. Again, keep in mind, you can, if you feel like it, suddenly turn the gravity off. Now cinema will just throw the cloth through space, slowly spinning, no gravity. It'll just sort of fly around and do its thing. So if you're trying to do perhaps some sort of underwater scene, maybe you're trying to do some educational video saying, oh, stop throwing plastic shopping bags into the ocean, you're killing all the animals, and you just want this nice, slow, swirling, undulating plastic bag, that would work quite nicely for that, just sort of swirling underwater, not particularly falling down, just floating along. Anyway, ignore those settings, they're not massively useful. So let's jump on over to dresser. Now, with some of this terminology, keep in mind, the cloth system was officially designed for putting clothing on characters. Truth is, it's really barely up to that task. You could just about put a very loose-fitting bit of cloth onto a character. But just so you know what to realistically expect, cinema's clothing system goes wrong whenever you take cloth and you scrunch it up. The problem that gives you is that as soon as your character puts their arm down, all of the cloth underneath your armpit suddenly gets scrunched up, and the realistic result you get is that the cloth system just explodes and the cloth goes everywhere. So that's why I say cinema's cloth system is quite good for blowing a flag, draping some cloth, putting some cloth over an object. It's hardly up to the task of actually clothing a character. It's doable and it's possible. You've just got to be super, super careful and have very low expectations of cinema's cloth. So we have our dresser tab with dressomatic and seams and other sort of clothing related terminology. Let me talk you through the bits you're actually going to want though. So the first thing, let's get a fresh bit of cloth, because I've probably put all sorts of weird settings on this. Let's add a plane, let's put it over there, make it editable, and give it a cloth tag. And let's divide it up again. Okay, so here's our fresh bit of cloth without any weird settings on there. Let's turn the divisions off. Okay, so on your cloth settings under dresser, the first thing you've got is relax. The relax button allows you to essentially set an initial position for your cloth. So when you model your cloth, it will almost certainly be this flat polygon object. But what if you want your animation to start with the cloth already draped over an object? Well, we can relax it. let's pause and rewind. When you press relax, it will play 10 frames of animation. So relax, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Relax, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And we'll press it maybe once or twice more. Relax, relax, relax. Okay, there we go. So I think this is a fairly reasonable starting pose for my cloth system. So once you've relaxed it into place for where you'd like the cloth to begin, you can tell the cloth system, hey, from now on, start in this pose. And this is the initial state button. So we can set the initial state for the cloth simulation by just hitting the button next to it that says set, and that's it, we're done. So you notice all those little crosses disappear. Those crosses were just there to let you know, hey, this hasn't been saved, or we're sort of in the dressing mode, adjusting the start position. But the initial state button sets how it should begin. So the other generally useful bit we've got in here is fixed points. I will just mention the Dressomatic, just because it's an interesting sounding button, and you're probably thinking, ooh, tell us about that, tell us about that. Dressomatic is a tool for taking cloth and shrink wrapping it to a surface. So the idea is you can draw a really big, loose piece of cloth, wrap it around your character, and then press the Dressomatic button, and it will sort of go and pull and shrink wrap the cloth. But as I say, Cinema's cloth is hardly suitable for doing clothing on characters, which makes the Dressomatic not the most useful thing you could ever possibly use. So I'll largely skip over it, I think. Yeah, let's skip over that one. Right, what I do want to show you though is fixed points. With your cloth system, let's undo a few steps and put it back up there. One thing you probably will want to do with cloth is attach it to something. If you're making a flag, you need to pin the cloth to a flagpole. If you're putting washing on a washing line blowing in the wind, you'll naturally want to attach it to the washing line. Or even if you're putting a cape on a character, you'll want to attach it to the shoulders. Or if you're being brave and you want to put some trousers on a character, you're going to want to attach the trousers to the waist, otherwise the trousers will just sort of slide straight down. So we have a couple of ways of doing this. It depends how fancy you want to get. I'll show you the quick and easy way first, and then I'll show you the slightly more impressive way. So the easiest way is fixed points. What we do with this is we select some points on the original cloth model that we want to basically pin and fix in place. So let's say I want to take my cloth and I want to pin it down here and here in the corners. So I'm just gonna select some points. So we'll go 1, 2, and then maybe sort of 3, 4, and 5. So I've got sort of 5 points along here selected that I want to pin in place. And it's nice and easy. You just go to your cloth tag, go down to dresser, and where it says fixed points, hit set. What you should notice is that these orange points, when I click this, they will turn purple. And a purple point is a fixed point. So when I press play, it is now set and fixed into place over there. So we now have some nice cloth draping down, attached to a rod or a curtain rail, and it'll happily drape down onto our model. Okay, quite nice. So as I said though, there is another choice. The problem we've got with this is it's incredibly difficult for me to move these points. If I select the points and I move them around, it doesn't do anything. They just ping, ba-doing, straight back into place. Because the cloth system has sort of taken over control. It's now in charge of where the points are. So when I try and move them, it just doesn't really do anything. You can work around this with sort of scripting in Espresso, but that's not a very fun way of doing it. So let me show you the alternative. So I'm going to pause this and rewind, and these purple fixed points I made, I'm going to clear them. Not guilty. The other choice you've got is a belt tag. Now, the belt tag was designed for basically trousers, because trousers keep falling down when you try and attach them to a character. So you can apply a belt and it'll keep them in place. So for us to do this, we need another bit of geometry. and I'm just going to make it editable just so that in case Cinema doesn't like it being not editable. Essentially, the cloth system prefers editable objects. Let's put it that way. So let's do that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to position this cylinder. Let's just give it a different material so it's easier to see. I'm going to position this cylinder over to the side. I'll spin it around and I'll just stretch it a bit longer. So I've basically got a sort of curtain rod, a curtain rail, a washing line running across by the cloth. And normally you would put this as close as you can so it's attached, but I'm going to leave a bit of space just because I want to show you what it does. But for this, go back to your cloth surface, your cloth object, sorry, and under tags where we found the cloth one, there is another one called cloth belt with a little icon of a belt buckle. Put this onto the cloth object. And what you'll find is it's only really got a couple of settings. One is the same sort of set and clear buttons we saw a minute ago, and the other one is asking us what it should be attached to. So I'm going to tell this plane of cloth the belt should be, so drag and drop, it should be attached to this cylinder, and so long as I've got some points still selected, I should still have those 5 same points selected from earlier, I can now press the set button, and there we go. So it's drawn these 5 yellow lines, which is basically just a visual indication that this is attached to this particular object. So when I press play now, it falls down, and at this point we have pretty much the exact same animation as when we just fixed them. But the difference, the advantage, is that I can select my cylinder, and I'll just give myself a little bit more space here for doing an animation. So let's extend it and rewind. I am free to move this around. So I can move my curtain rail, I can rotate it around. Let's rewind. I could even scale it. So here's one nice bit of advice. If you're ever trying to do an animation of a curtain opening and closing where it sort of crumples up, which stretches out, belt it to a rod and then just animate the rod resizing, because that will crumple up your curtain or stretch it out. So that's quite a nice way of sort of stretching or crumpling something up. Just keyframe and animate the thing which it's attached to with a belt. But anyway, there you go. That's Cinema's belt tag. Let's go back to our cloth and see what other settings we've got. So skip over the rest of those. Not hugely important. Let's go to cache. So this can potentially be slow. Cinema might need a lot of processing power to run the cloth simulation. If that's the case, or there's other reasons for doing this, maybe you're going to send it to a render farm and you just want to make sure that the cloth is pre-calculated so each of your render machines doesn't maybe come out with a different physics simulation. Or maybe, hey, this sphere I've got laying down there, maybe I'll tell you what, I'll just undo a few steps because I've messed up my curtain rod there a bit. So here's my curtain rod. Maybe I like this animation, but I need to get rid of the sphere. What you can do is you can sort of bake and cache the physics simulation. So on the cloth tag, rewind, just say calculate cache. Boop, 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 ba-doo, doo, 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 and done. Right, there we go, it's calculated. So it takes 5 megs of RAM, not much. But this is now a fully baked simulation. So the first advantage is I can scrub through the simulation, which you can't normally do. I could actually get rid of the thing it collides with and it will still have the same physics. So there's another advantage. But as I say, this is quite good if you're going to be rendering over a network, over a render farm, because you really need to cache your physics simulations for safety. And the usual settings, you can load the data, save the data, empty the cache so it's just sort of a regular full simulation again. And here's an interesting bit, update frame. If during your simulation you notice some part of this goes wrong, you can fix it manually. You can actually go to your plane, update the position of whatever point or polygon is the problematic one, and you can sort of update the frame to sort of save it back in. Now, I need to show you about disabling the cloth system, because as you notice here, when I move this point, as soon as I let go, ba-doing, it goes back again. So you do actually have to turn the cloth system off. If you go back to this tab, turn off the automatic system, and that pretty much turns the cloth system off. But then you can update the frame in the cache. Again, it's not something I've ever particularly needed to do, but you can update it if you need to just fix a little error with a point. Okay, last page over here then are expert settings. So I've already shown you self-collision. That's kind of the big important one. Other things we've got subsampling. So with any physics system in cinema, what you'll get is a cinema will update the physics on each frame, or depending on the physics system and the default settings, it will update several times per frame. So, for example, with the cloth system, we have subsampling of 3, which means every frame of animation this cloth system is moving, it will update it a certain number of times in between. So if an object is here on frame 1 and here on frame 2, it has actually calculated it several times in between those 2 frames. So if you're finding your cloth system goes a little bit mad, and the most likely cause of this is very fast movement. If you have very high speed objects hitting the cloth, it's possible that here's your cloth surface. On one frame your colliding object could be here, but then on the next frame it's moving so fast that it's actually gone all the way beyond it and it's now sitting on the other side. It's possible that the cloth system won't see the collision because there was no collision. It went frame 1, frame 2, frame 3, frame 4, and at no point did it hit it. Subsampling is how many checks it does from one frame to the next. So if things are going wrong, add more subsampling. But again, do keep in mind you will get worse processing times, so the frame rate will drop. And the other thing you can notice is the behavior will change. So whilst the cloth with a setting of 3 might gently fall down and drape onto an object, with more subsampling you might notice the cloth suddenly goes bleh, and it just very quickly falls down. It does almost sort of change the speed of the calculation, but if you've got fast moving stuff you have to turn this thing up. Let's skip over that. That's not very fun. It never really helps. And let's go down to these. So EPS. Not really sure what it stands for. It could be epsilon. I'm going to have to Google that one. But what it does is these are your collision margins. So let's undo a few steps. Let's put our sphere back in. Let's lose the cache on the physics sim. And let's get close. So I'm going to press play. And the cloth falls down. But here's the thing. The cloth isn't actually touching the object. If I put that texture on there, I'm just going to turn off the smoothing because this will sort of give you a false impression. These polygons do not touch the sphere. There is always a slight gap. Now it's very, very difficult for me to show this, but trust me, there is a slight gap in between the cloth and the sphere we have sitting underneath. And that's what the EPS is. How much of a gap does it leave? Now, this is okay if you take a default plane and a default sphere and drop one on the other, because these things are 4 meters wide. They're huge. But if you're doing something to scale and you're actually going to get close, suddenly noticing a 1.5 centimeter gap, about half an inch for the Americans, you're going to notice a half-inch gap from one surface to another. So you might need to turn this down. But the lower it gets, the more chance there is that one object will just poke through and stick through the other object. So swings and roundabouts, choose your poison, But these EPS values are quite high by default. So maybe just sort of halve them, quarter them, turn them down a bit. Right, as for the basic cloth system, that will do. There is still 1 or 2 more bits I want to show you, some advice, some hints, and 1 or 2 other objects. So just before we leave this cloth tag, I want to show you how to do a very basic thing which you can't do unless you know the secret. Do you want to know what the thing is? Here's my cloth. Let's lose the belt. Let's lose the cylinder. Let's just go with a bit of cloth falling on a sphere. So it falls down, lands, good. Okay, here's the question. How do I move the cloth? Move tool? Nope, can't move it. Cinema's cloth system sets up this initial state. Remember when we were playing around with the relax setting, and we were saying, oh, this is the initial position. That sets it in stone. It is absolutely hard set. You cannot move this cloth. You've got to jump through a little hoop if you decide, this cloth should be somewhere else. So in order for us to move it, we've got to turn the cloth system off. And we do this under the very basic tab. Now, there's very few reasons to ever really go here, except for this one single checkbox. But what we have to do is disable the cloth system. I am now free to move the cloth around wherever I like. But we can't just turn it back on again, because if we do this, it just jumps straight back where it was before. So what we've got to do is turn the cloth system off, position the object where we want it to actually be, and reinitialize the first state. So go to dresser, set the initial state for the cloth, and then turn the cloth system back on. Now when I press play, it will stay where it is and fall down from that position. So in short, turn the cloth off, make your adjustments, and then reinitialize the initial state for the cloth, and then finally you can turn the cloth system back on. It's a bit annoying, I will admit, but tough. That's how it works. Okay, so that will largely do for the cloth system. What I want to show you sort of last of all is underneath Simulate, we have a cloth menu. And in here you will find Cloth Surface. Now, this is pretty much 99% the same as a subdivision surface. Subdivision surface for the uninitiated, let's just hide this. Subdivision surface is a smoothing tool. So when you have this sort of horrible polygonized faceted surface, you can turn on a subdivision surface to smoothen it. Brilliant. However, it suffers from two limitations. The first limitation is that this subdivision, let's zoom in here, it always slightly shrinks the object. So here's my actual cloth, here's the smooth version. It always gets very slightly smaller, which if you have cloth sitting on an object and that cloth all of a sudden gets slightly smaller, this object it was sitting on will very, very often just poke through the underlying surface. So that's the first big problem this thing has. In fact, let's see if I can make it do it. Let's grab a cube. Let's put the cube down here, put it pointy side up, and pop it down there. Just need to give it a cloth colliding tag. So when I press play with this, it falls down, and you can see at the minute it's okay. The cloth lands on it, it stays still. I don't have any penetration issues. But if I subdivide the cloth and I smoothen it, you'll see all of a sudden, ooh, it pokes through here, it pokes through in the corner. It's just unfortunate. But don't worry, we have the cloth surface. That's why it was made. So cloth surface gives us a few abilities. And the first ability is, well, the first ability is really just a behavior. The cloth surface uses a slightly different algorithm of the subdivision surface, which doesn't shrink the cloth. So if I replace my, let's just show you the wireframe here. So if I replace my subdivision with a cloth surface, so basically just put your cloth not in here, but instead in here, it doesn't shrink. So that's the first big advantage. It doesn't shrink the cloth down. There is a slight downside with this, by the way, in that it gives a slightly worse quality. So I would say, where possible, use the subdivision surface because it gives you a nice smooth finish. But where you need to, use the cloth surface. You will still get a few jagged edges. Keep in mind you can turn up how many subdivisions it has, but it will still be a little bit a little bit bobbly and a little bit lumpy. It's just unfortunately how the algorithm works. Subdivisions give smoother finishes, cloth surfaces, they don't shrink, but they'll be slightly bobbly. Anyway, by the way, use both. Maybe subdivide it with the cloth and then put that inside a subdivision and it will smoothen it off. That's what I'll very often do. Use both. Okay, so that's one thing it does. The other thing it does is it has thickness. So you may have noticed up until now, all of our cloth is absolutely razor thin. Oh no, how do we get thickness? We can't have thickness on the original cloth, because if you try and do that, then one side of your cloth will just penetrate through the other side of the cloth. You'll never keep these two cloth surfaces individual from each other. They will go through. So what you do is you put the thickness on afterwards with the cloth surface. So down here, thickness, just turn it on. There we go. We now have an edge and a bit of thickness to the cloth. Here's another time where using the subdivision also works very well, because I can put that inside subdivision, and that horrible, harsh, crisp edge is now a much smoother, nicer edge. So use a bit of both. Use both of their advantages. Right, so on to the final thing, unless I suddenly think of anything else. Tearing. Tearing requires the cloth surface. So before, when I was looking, let's just lose these green objects for a second. Back on our cloth tag, under the tag settings, the very last thing in here was use tear. And when I press play, if I enable tearing, it generally doesn't work that well. It sort of breaks and it tears, but you get this weird, big, stretchy, giant, horrible mess. And this is just simply because the tearing system requires a cloth surface object. So if I put my plane inside a cloth surface, we'll just forget that subsurface subdivision object for a second. This will now look decent. It will tear and it will fall down into lots of nice little shreds. So let's just shorten the animation. So the cloth falls, it hits the sharp edge, and it rips. It tears apart. But if I don't have this cloth surface, the tearing just makes this horrible big mess. It sort of works, but it just makes a giant mess. You have to have a cloth surface for this to work. So that's its sort of final use. But let me just mention how you control the tearing, because by default, objects will always just shred themselves to pieces at the slightest collision. Think right back to the start. Remember I said all of this cloth is a series of springs. From one polygon to the next, you have a spring connecting them and sort of putting tension on. When that spring stretches past a certain point, it tears, it breaks, and then you will get a rip in the cloth. That is what the tear setting is. The tear setting is how far does the spring have to stretch before it gives in, buckles, and stops connecting. Which at 120% means you can only take your spring, which is say this long, and stretch it 20% to this long. Anything more than that and it rips and then it just suddenly shreds. That is why the cloth so easily, so readily just shreds itself to pieces and collapses. So this is really a threshold. The higher the threshold gets, the stronger the cloth is. The lower it gets, the more easily it rips. So if I go down to maybe 110, this cloth will rip even more easily than it did before. But if I go higher, let's say 150, there we go. This is a much stronger, much more rigid, structurally sound cloth. So play around with this value in here and just get the value right. Turn it up for more strength, turn it down for weakness. And the very, very, very final thing I will mention for Cinema's cloth system is the maps. Not sure if you ever looked into them before, but these are Vertex Map drop boxes. So maybe maybe I want my cloth to be strong in one area and weak in another. Or just looking at other potential uses for it, maybe I want my cloth to be stiff in one area and loose in another. For this, we need a vertex map. And I'm not going to get into all the depth of doing a vertex map. I'll just give you the really short version of this. Let's rewind. Let's turn off the cloth thickness object for a moment. You can paint influence onto your object. So the really short version is choose the polygon object, go to point mode, and grab your live selection tool from the main toolbar. There are other tools for doing this if you have Cinema's character animation tools, but I'm not covering those today. So for now, grab your live selection tool, and down here, you might be thinking, well, isn't this just the tool you use for selecting points? And yeah, it is, but it has some other interesting abilities which often go overlooked. And one of these is vertex painting mode. So with the live selection tool, down here we are in normal mode, or it really should be called something like regular or standard. It's nothing to do with the surface normals. Change this. Switch this to vertex painting mode. And what you will get now is the same old brush, but as soon as you click, it turns red. You now have a paintbrush which blends between yellow and red. Yellow is full strength, red is no strength. So what we could do with this, for example, in terms of cloth, is paint stiff parts of the cloth or loose parts of the cloth. Or for the tearing, we could paint strong parts of the cloth where it won't rip, and weak parts of the cloth where it will rip. So perhaps I want my cloth to rip straight down the middle. I could paint all of this bright yellow, so this is full strength, and I'll also paint this bit over here full yellow. And down here you've got your brush strength. So if I get a slightly smaller brush and I reduce the strength, so I'll have some 75% strong cloth here, some 50% strong cloth here, 25 here, and I'll leave this down at 0. So strong cloth, medium strength cloth, really weak cloth. And when we do this painting, it makes this tag, this little gradient. This is our vertex map. If I click on here, I can give it a name. We'll call this tearing vertex map, tearing VMap. And now back in my cloth, I can say for the tearing, use this vertex map. So what you will see is probably as soon as I press play, this red area will almost certainly rip instantaneously because it has no strength. So let's press play and see what we get. Oop, don't forget to turn on the cloth surface, otherwise it doesn't work. In fact, actually this is all far too weak. So let me just turn up the strength of my cloth. Let's go 200% strength. Okay, 300% strength. Let's keep going, 500. So I've probably painted these things too weak, but you can hopefully see that along this bit here where I painted this vertex map, we get to choose how strong that cloth is. So when it falls down, those bits are far too weak, so they just rip as soon as the air hits them. But I can now sort of rip this strategically down the middle, and you can choreograph where your cloth will rip. Right, I think that is enough for now. If you do have any questions on the cloth system, ask me down below in the comments and I'll do my best to answer. Once again, this is Mash from 3D Fluff. I hope you enjoyed these videos. If you want to see some more or have a look at some of my work, go visit 3dfluff.com. That will be me. If you'd like to have a look at some benchmarks, I have another website, cbscores.com, for Cinebench results. As ever, go look at my friend Noseman, Athanasios' channel. I'll link that at the end here. But until the next video, I hope that's been useful. Goodbye. If you're in the UK, I can offer you in-person Cinema 4D training, or if you're anywhere else around the world, we can do the same thing over Skype. Just contact me on 3dfluff.com and I'll get back to you.